Welcome to The Real Talk. I'm Ramona Benson. In 2017, we witnessed a real cultural shift. More specifically, it was the women's movement. The Me Too movement kicked into high gear. But what is this movement? And where did it originate from? This movement, specifically the hashtag #MeToo, was created by Tarana Burke, the founder of a non-for-profit organization to help survivors of sexual violence since 2006, to encourage young women to show solidarity with one another. But how did this become so popular? It wasn't until actor Elisa Milano used this hashtag #MeToo in October of 2017 and saying on her Twitter, "If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write Me Too" as a reply to this tweet. She wrote this, went to sleep. She woke up the next day and found more than 30,000 people had used the hashtag #MeToo. Milano burst into tears. A real movement had started. In France, women took to the streets, chanting not only Me Too, but also Balance ton porc, which translates roughly to expose your pig. A hashtag conceived by French journalist Sandra Muller in the weeks after the Me Too first surfaced. Versions of it swept in 85 countries, from India, where struggles against harassment, assault had already become a national debate in recent years, to the Middle East, Asia, and parts in between. The language used by men who would become America's 45th president, captured on a 2005 recording, was by any standard vulgar. That was Donald Trump. When he didn't just talk about fondling women, he bragged about grabbing them by the private parts. The outrage that occurred when Donald Trump, who would express himself in such a vulgar manner, still would be elected as president, is a part of what stoked the rage that fueled the Women's March the day after his inauguration. Further then, we saw it in media, where Fox News cut ties with Bill O'Reilly, their favorite anchor who brought in all the revenue, when New York Times reported that he and the company had spent about $13 million to settle claims against him from 5 women. In October, the Times revealed a 6th settlement, bringing that total up to $45 million. So it was a culture that was known within the media industry, within Fox News, that then came to light and he had to let go. Bill Cosby, which was another person we grew up with through The Cosby Show, was brought to trial of charges of sexual assault over several decades of nearly 50 women. Although the case ended in a mistrial, it is scheduled to be retried in April of this year. Then we continued. I mean, it was just news after news where every day you woke up and you saw the news and there was something new that hit the headlines about the Me Too movement. On October 5th, the New York Times published the first story to expose Harvey Weinstein. And, him being one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, a leading Democratic political fundraiser, a man who was behind many Oscar wins for the movies that he pioneered, as well as actors he brought on. Well, with more than 84 women coming forward with charges of sexual misconduct to assault, that actually drove everybody crazy, where Hollywood actually came to light and talked about their issues, leading women who'd been through it all along. Back to politics, with Roy Moore, the Alabama Republican nominee for the Senate, was accused by an adult woman of abusing her when she was just 14 years old, and he was a 32-year-old assistant district attorney. 9 other women came forward, and therefore he lost the election that year. Minnesota Democratic Senator Al Franken groped another woman during a USO tour in 2006. That was before he was in office, and for those reasons, because of all the allegations and the news around it, he also resigned. Prior to that, we had the Take Back the Night movement, which is an international event, a non-for-profit organization with a mission of ending sexual, relationship, domestic abuse of all forms. And this was all before Me Too that had started, where hundreds of events are held over 30 countries annually. The rape culture has been discussed openly in the media for the last few years. And this was actually brought to surface where a university student, Brock Turner, who was sentenced to 6 months in jail and 3 years of probation for sexually assaulting a woman outside a fraternity party in 2015, of a woman that just laid unconscious while he assaulted her and was caught by cyclists nearby. This sentence, which was far more lenient than what the prosecutor sought for, provoked public outrage and drew fresh attention to an issue that has been recently sparked in the university campuses across the country. The reality is this, that 90% of women don't report rape when they're a victim of it because they have to go through the onus of proving it in court. But far beyond that, if we want to go into what this all means, we have to understand that if we want the law to protect women, we have to go into seeing where did this actually occur, specifically in Canada. Back before 1929, there was the Persons case, where women were not considered as persons in Canada. And if you can just imagine this, that this was less than 100 years ago. Suffragist Emily Murphy was outraged by not being considered a person in her own country. Determined and ready for a fight, she actually found a little provision in the Supreme Court of Canada Act that said that any 5 person acting as a unit could form a petition and bring it to the Supreme Court for interpretation of any part of the Constitution. That is when the famous 5 was created. They signed a letter petitioning the Supreme Court to look into the matter of whether the government could appoint a female senator. We have female senators today in Canada, but this is before it could all happen. This matter quickly became known as the Persons case and grew outrage when it was debated on in 1929, with the Supreme Court eventually ruling that women were not qualified persons, and related to Section 24 of the British North America Act, they could not be considered a person, therefore not eligible to be a senator. One woman, Mary Ellen Smith from British Columbia, reacted to the news saying, "The iron dropped into the souls of women in Canada when we heard that it took a man to decree that his mother was not a person." At the time, there was one authority even higher than the Supreme Court of Canada, the Privy Council in England. So they petitioned the Privy Council to rule on the matter. On October 18, 1929, Lord Sankey arrived to a packed courtroom in London to read the Privy Council's judgment. To the relief and joy of the famous 5 and the women across Canada, the Privy Council said that yes, women were indeed persons and could become a senator. The first senator in Canada was Karen Ree McKay Wilson, who was appointed to the Senate at the age of 45 in February 1930 by the government of Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, just 4 months after the Persons case judgment. Now, just to give you a breakdown of what that meant is, before a woman was considered a person, if she were to become married, she would become a person with her husband. And what that would be is, it would be if she had property, therefore it would be a joint property. If she was in an abusive relationship, and if she called the police to say, my husband has abused me, or I have suffered from assault of any sort, she could not press charges because they were considered as one person, and legally a person cannot abuse themselves back then. A person could not rape themselves. And therefore, it was very critical for women to have rights and to be able to be considered a person legally by the definition by Canadian law. The right to vote and work and the right to respect at work were hard fought by women. There wasn't even a name for sexual harassment until just over 40 years ago. The term was coined in 1975, if you can believe it, by a group of women at the Cornell University after an employee there, Carmita Wood, filed an unemployment benefits after she had resigned because her supervisor had touched her. The university denied her claim, arguing that she left the job for personal reasons. And then fast forward to Me Too movement and this year's Oscar speech by Oprah, where she claimed time's up movement, staying quiet no longer is a way to go just to be able to keep your job. And as the movement grew, there also grew more casualties from the political, media, and entertainment industry. And many called this a witch hunt against men, that now you stand to lose all that you have worked for in a lifetime after an unproven allegation of sexual misconduct. The consensus amongst men who openly supported the movement but secretly started to feel fear of working with women could be the unforeseeable future, where they did not feel the ability to be able to speak out, and any of the male opponents spoke out against the movement were quickly hushed down. That now sexual misconduct is a fireable offense, and that you could risk losing your reputation, your good name, and the entirety of your life's work, which was almost the same punishment as somebody who'd been charged as a rapist, who'd been tried in the court of law. That you were no longer innocent until proven guilty, rather guilty at the onset of the accusation, and were cast aside by society as not playing by its rules that were actually different before the movement. Those rules that were accepted by, people thinking, that's just men being men, or that's just locker room talk. The backlash of women, actually 100 French women signed an open letter published in the Le Monde offering an alternative view of the Me Too campaign, which drew tremendous attention of what they regard as a rampant censorship in the feminist ranks. In signing the letter, the French film star Catherine Deneuve set the feminist world ablaze, which she actually later felt pressure to apologize for as well. Whether it was pressure or not, she did clarify her stance. So we have, we saw this Me Too movement happening all across the world in the US and across the pond in, Europe and abroad. But Me Too also came into Canada. And it started this year in 2018 in Nova Scotia, where Jamie Bailey was asked to resign as PC leader after the allegations of inappropriate behavior, of misconduct, which quickly moved to Ontario at the end of January with then PC leader Patrick Brown, who had to step down because of sexual allegations of misconduct. And then Ottawa, where Calgary Liberal MP Kent Hare quit the federal cabinet for the same reasons, followed by his other Liberal MP in Calgary, Darshan Kong, who quit the Liberal caucus last August after complaints of sexual harassment surfacing, followed by NDP MP Aaron Weir. Going into media, Paul Bliss, a reporter at CTV News Queen's Park Bureau, was also suspended until an investigation that is underway after sexual misconduct allegations. So when did things actually change? Because as we saw everybody, in politics and in media in Canada being let go until investigations were to be underway, we saw a shift in that and it started with actually the agenda Steve Paikin. He had actually the same allegations against him as well, but he didn't have to resign. He didn't have to be suspended until allegations were proven or investigated. And then we saw the return of Patrick Brown with his two-part series on national TV, which said his side of the story about the allegations that were reported earlier in the year, weeks prior, were not accurate, because he was able to track down where he lived, who he was around, and the scenario of that environment, and actually had a few people testifying in media, in public, about the accounts of that story. And therefore, he was able to come back in as a candidate and run for the leadership of the PC party, which again changed the narrative, because everybody believed that Patrick Brown, who was the then PC party leader, weeks and months prior to a general election and potentially to be Premier of Ontario, had to step down for unproven allegations that was reported in a CTV News. And what this did is it halted everybody to kind of listen to what were the reasons behind the allegations, what happened, how did we go so fast from 0 to 100 where somebody was employed and no longer the day after, and their entire life's work completely destroyed, until we actually started listening to the other side of the story. it makes me think about what we actually want, right? The ideal world is where men and women can work together without abuse of power. That is really where we want to go, which side of the Me Too movement you're on. And one thing we've realized is through this movement and, the person's case, when people in the position of power come forward, that's when real change can take place. Where you have women in Hollywood who've come over and, raised a fund to be able for women who need to go to court and to defend themselves against allegations, sexual allegations, misconduct, as well as assault. That really resonated with the base and actually worldwide, where they brought attention to it. They used their platform for a greater use and purpose by bringing this social change for the same reasons as you had the famous five going forward and bringing it to the Supreme Court to make sure that women were considered as people, as a person under Canadian law. So what that does mean is if you are somebody who has a network and you are somebody who has a platform, you have to be able to use it for social good, to be able to bring awareness. But how far does this awareness go in terms of controlling the social shift, which we've now seen in Canada, that even though there was a correction of human behavioral correction between men and women, and there are women who've been accused of sexual misconduct allegations as well. But really, at the end of the day, it's about listening to the stories and understanding where it's coming from and to be able to judge accordingly and hold people accountable under the court of law and not just, public opinion. Times are changing. We are in an era where we're electing politicians such as Donald Trump, without any political history because, we want the change and the difference. We're in an era where women are able to speak forward and come forward and get the support that they need in an environment that was before not tolerated, and they were judged against for accusations or for experiences that they had gone through in their career, whether it's in their personal lives or in their professional lives. And that's why we're in a shifting time, and it is very critical that we are able to actually look at issues and be able to discuss it in an open platform and come into a consensus where men and women can work together and have a dialogue about these issues. What the Me Too movement has taught us is that we want a future that is greater and better for the younger generation, where they can grow up in an environment where they can respect one another and be able to work with one another. And that actually comes from a role of parents being able to educate their children about how they should treat one another and the opposite sex, and that there should be really no difference between them in terms of how they relate to one another and how they treat one another. As far as going down to curriculum in schools, so we're not in an environment where we need a massive correction and a change and shift of ideology of what is acceptable to say to the opposite sex or how to behave, but rather, or fear to work with one another or be alone with one another between he said or she said stories, but rather be able to come together as one human being with another to make a better future and to be able to work together. And you know what? Media has a really important role in this. Now that we're seeing equality in media, we're seeing women in leading roles, it will give a bit better hope for women growing up, as well as men who will respect women and their counterparts. Thank you for listening today. I'm Ramona Benson, and this was The Real Talk.